Welcome to another edition of the Law and Gospel Devotional. My name is Erick Sorensen, and each week I take some time to look with you at God's two words from all of the Scriptures, both His Word of Law, which tells us what we ought to do, what we shouldn't do, and the consequences for breaking both, and of course His Word of Gospel, which tells us about the good news that Christ has delivered the forgiveness of sins to us through His life, death, resurrection, and ascension. We look for those two words in every passage of Scripture that we go over. Last week, the last couple weeks, we have been in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul's epistle to the Galatians, and really it's been gospel on blast. The first week, as we looked at Galatians chapters 3 and 4, we saw Paul defending the idea that we must be saved on account of Christ alone and nothing else added to it at all. And then the previous week, just before this one, we talked about what it looks like to live as freed people, what the freedom of a Christian actually is meant to be, how that looks in our lives, or at least how God intends it to be. And really, we're continuing on that theme today as we conclude chapter 5 with one last verse that I would argue probably should be included in chapter 6, but nevertheless, this is the way it goes sometimes that the chapter breaks. If you listen to the podcast I co-host, 30 Minutes in the New Testament, you know that my co-host Dan Price and I are always sort of whining about the fact that there's so many breaks and chapter breaks where they ought not be. Of course, that's because we can do that because the chapter breaks and the verses are not inspired. They were added later after the writings by various editors. Nevertheless, this is one of those examples again. But big whoop, we'll just start it off one verse before we get into chapter 6, and then we'll dive into the rest of that chapter. So without further ado, if I could describe what Galatians 6 really is all about, it's about life together. And life together as freed people. If we are indeed freed up in the gospel and freed up by the power of the Holy Spirit, well, this creates a new community, as the Apostle Paul will detail in many of his letters, but probably most fully in his letter to the Corinthians, because, of course, they were having such problems fellowshipping together and living as a body, living as a church. There was so much tension there. And, of course, we know that that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, that this is still something that needs to be addressed all the time. So what we have to look at today is very applicable. So how do we define fellowship? Well, I mean, we're familiar with the term fellowship, especially if we're part of a church body, but of course we're also familiar with it because of its power in pop culture as we think about films like The Fellowship of the Ring and the book before that. The Oxford Dictionary defines fellowship as, quote, a friendly association, especially with people who share one's interests. Well, ultimately, folks, that is true of any number of fellowships. The church's fellowship is really based on one overarching interest, and that is Christ. And to the degree, and I've said this many other times before, to the degree that a fellowship starts being united around or interested in and binded by anything other than Christ and what He's done for us, that is the degree to which that fellowship will become unhealthy. The fellowship must be united around that interest. That is ultimately our uniting bond. That's what brings us together. And so Paul is going to talk about using your freedom to be in fellowship. Yes, part of being free is being free in community with others who have been saved by the grace of God as well. And so he starts off in verse 26 of chapter 5 saying, "Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other." Now notice the each other language there. That's where we're really getting into fellowship language. And there's a lot that he says here. The word for conceited, for example, literally means empty praise. Don't seek after empty praise. What do we mean when we say that? Well, really, it just means that this is a person who's looking for praise sake. In other words, they're a glory hog. Now you say, boy, I don't like those people. Well, watch out, fella, because it turns out that all of us are prone to wanting to be glory hogs as well. Even if we do it subtly, there's all sorts of things that we can do to try and get the little pat on the back and get the credit for something we didn't do. And as a matter of fact, even if we don't get the credit, we might find ourselves getting a little irked that someone hasn't noticed the thing that we did. And of course, this is all motivated by insecurity. When somebody needs that empty praise, they're trying to find a way to feel more secure, and that behavior can't help, or that sort of heart disposition can't help but manifest itself in the two things Paul mentions in verse 26, which is provoking and envying each other. And when I think about the contrast between those two, I think about provoking as sort of jockeying for position, or on the other hand, being envious, looking up to those or looking at those that have more than you in some way or have something that you wish you did, and you find yourself jealous of them. And of course, that's going to always break down a sense of unity and a sense of bonding that we have. And so we don't want to be people that, as a church, are trying to stand out as individuals to get our gold medals for nothing. That's not the point here. No, Paul wants to emphasize that though we each individually have gifts, true, as he'll say in 1 Corinthians often, nevertheless, we are all one body, and provoking and envying each other, being conceited, just does not fit in to living a life of freedom together. And so what has to happen? Well, ultimately, Paul's going to say if we're going to live a life in which we're not conceited and we're not glory hogs, well, then we're going to have to be humbled. And yes, humility is a part of being free. I know this is counter to everything that the world tells you. I know this is counter to everything your nature tells you. But it is just the reality that when we are humbled, we are actually free. This is another one of those paradoxical things about the kingdom of God. The great church father Augustine said, "It was pride that changed angels into devils. It is humility that makes men as angels." And C.S. Lewis once quipped, "A man who is eating or lying with his wife or preparing to go to sleep in humility, thankfulness, and temperance is, by Christian standards, in an infinitely higher state than one who is listening to Bach or reading Plato in a state of pride." Yes, indeed. Folks, there's a reason that the painting of the praying man, or the picture of the praying man, which incidentally, I don't even know that he's praying, but the man simply pausing before he's about to eat his daily bread, is so popular, because it is a picture of humility and gratitude. It is a recognition, well, really, that there but by the grace of God go I. Because that's the foundation of fellowship. When each of us can look at one another, no matter what we've done, no matter what we've struggled with, no matter what sins we drag into the doors on Sunday or into our homes, when each of us can look at each other and say, there but by the grace of God go I, well, that can't help but foster humility and fellowship and a sense of camaraderie, because all of us recognize we are only sinners saved by grace. Again, I like the definition of humility that C.S. Lewis gave, where he said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. Yes, it's just a matter of perspective. And so, yes, if we're going to be in fellowship together, then humility is going to be a necessary ingredient for that fellowship to take place. Nevertheless, a buzzword right now in the culture, and something that I think many people desperately crave, I certainly saw this when I was a church planter in New York City, I heard it all the time, is quote-unquote community. People wanted fellowship. People really craved it. Well, we've already gone over the sort of first ingredient to that fellowship, which isn't always so attractive, which is humility. But Paul's going to continue, okay? You really want community. You're not just saying that. You don't just want to hang out, but you want real community. Well, then you're going to have to be gracious. Yes, indeed. As he continues on with this theme of being with each other, he is going to insist that they display grace. Look at verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Now let's break that apart a little bit. First of all, Paul reminds his readers that they are family because he calls them brothers, and you could translate it brothers and sisters, brothers. The second thing he notes when he talks to them is he says, brother, if anyone is caught. Now the word for caught there is could be translated trapped in Greek. If anyone is trapped in a transgression, the word for transgression is literally a false step. Now that's really appropriate because just a couple of verses earlier, what does Paul say? Let us keep in step with the Spirit. So transgression is getting out of step with the Spirit. And transgression is something that all of us are going to struggle with and have struggled with for all of our lives. Paul has instructions for one another, for these members of the church, for how we deal with someone who is caught, is trapped in sin. And what does he say? He says, you who are spiritual, in other words, you who may not be caught in that particular sin, restore that person in a spirit of gentleness. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard this before, but it is true that the word for restore there is the word that's often used for mending a net or talking about gently resetting a broken bone. In other words, it is being very careful. Now, there's something that I do want to note in this. Number one, what this presupposes is that if somebody is stuck in a sin, maybe it's an addiction or maybe it's some other problem, but they seem to be trapped by it, we are, in fact, called to acknowledge it. That doesn't mean gossip about it. That doesn't mean hold a church council meeting to talk about this person's problems. There may be a time for that, as Jesus outlines in Matthew 18, but that's not our initial move at all. No, that's way down the line. No, Paul simply says the first move is to seek to restore that person gently. It means there will be confrontation, but confrontation doesn't have to be loud, and it doesn't have to be angry, and it doesn't have to be mean, and it doesn't have to be exclusionary necessarily at all. No, the point is always restoration. This is a form of church discipline, and yet the way it's to be done is very graciously. Thus the word gently, like we are healing something or mending a net. And this just goes to show, folks, that really when we talk about living in freedom, the freedom of the Christian, which is Galatians 5 and into Galatians 6, it's really impossible to live as freed people if we refuse to forgive. I'm not telling any tales out of school here, folks. There's no one that is more enslaved as a Christian than a Christian who gives into bitterness and anger and refuses to forgive. The fact is, there's nothing more anti-Christian than refusing forgiveness, and there's nothing more Christ-like than extending forgiveness. If you don't believe me, just look up the parable of the wicked servant found in Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. I won't rehash all of it, but you know the story if you're familiar with your Bible. You know that Peter asked Jesus how many times that he should forgive, and he even asked Jesus, thinking he's being generous, 7 times, and Jesus says 70 times 7, which does not mean 490 times, and then you get to slug the other dude in the face. No, it means that we should always be forgiving, and then he gives a parable about this servant who was forgiven millions and millions and millions, let's make it billions of dollars in today's coin, by somebody that he owed, and yet when he found somebody, after receiving all this forgiveness, he found somebody that owed him a few bucks, he strangled him and had him thrown in jail. And as a result, the man who had forgiven him all his debt ends up punishing him for his lack of mercy, saying, after I forgave you, how could you dare hold this sin against another person? The point is clear, folks. Forgiveness is just part of what it means to be free, and it's part of what it means to be in community, because guaranteed, promise you, people in the church will let you down, they will sin against you, they will struggle, they will fail, and you will too. This is just a reality. If we don't have forgiveness, then we don't have a fellowship. That's the truth. Again, to give C.S. Lewis all sorts of exposure in today's devotion, he says, a self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. We are called, the fact is, to have compassion, and in fact the compassion of Christ, who says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench. So, yeah, if you want community, folks, that's part of this gig. That's part of what it means to be in fellowship. But also at the same time, Paul, not being naive, Paul says, watch yourself. Watch yourself. That's what he says right after he tells them to restore someone gently. He says, keep watching yourself lest you too be tempted. Paul knows the allure of sin, and Paul knows that it's possible for someone that's lending a hand to suddenly be dragged down into the pit they were lending a hand into. And so once again, how do we avoid that? Humility is the key. If we recognize from the very beginning that there, but by the grace of God go I, if we don't have the attitude that says, oh, I would never struggle with that particular sin, but we have the attitude that it's always possible that I could struggle with any particular sin, then that will help us along the way as we seek to extend forgiveness to others. And by the way, just because it's possible that we could be dragged down, it's possible that we might be tempted. Folks, it's still worth the risk if it means we could restore our brother or sister. It's worth the risk to lend the hand. We just need to be careful and need to be humble as we approach our friends in the congregation with whatever they might be struggling with. Paul continues on in this same theme of fellowship, saying we've got to carry each other. Look at verse 2. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Real community means never saying, essentially, you're on your own this time, pal. No. Real community means saying, I'm going to carry you, like Samwise carries Frodo in the wonderful Lord of the Rings story. As the Apostle Paul says in Romans 12, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Now there is, I should note, a two-sided responsibility here implied again when Paul says bear one another's burdens. And that is, number one, that there has to be a person that's willing to admit they have a burden that they can't carry on their own. And number two, there has to be a person willing to help carry that burden. Yes, indeed. And sometimes I think some of us who carry burdens are too proud, and we don't think of it as pride, but we're too proud to admit that we need help. I know that, just honest confession time, that is my biggest struggle. My biggest struggle is actually admitting I need help, asking for help. And yet, there's nothing more freeing and nothing that lends itself to fellowship more than admitting you're weak, that you've got weaknesses too. Where you might be strong in one area, another person is weak, and your strength might help them and vice versa. Doesn't do us any good to pretend otherwise. Paul goes on exhorting the Galatian church and us to be honest. He says, if anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. In other words, if I could paraphrase it, he says, recognize you need the help of others too. You don't help others from a place of superiority, which I think too often we do. We come at the person who needs help thinking that we've got it all together or giving off an air that we do. No, that's not the way we go. But we come really with the posture of a fellow pilgrim that says, I'm just one beggar telling another beggar where to get bread. Yes, indeed, that's the posture. That's the way we come. We don't look at a person who's struggling with a sin that we don't and go, ugh, how could they? Again, there, but by the grace of God go I. Not conceited, but humble. And then Paul has a strange verse here right after in verse 4 that frankly a whole lot of commentaries don't make a whole lot of sense of, but we'll go over it and then we'll try and piece it all together. He says in verse 4, but let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. Wait, say that again? Paul, you just said carry each other's burdens, and now you're saying each will have to bear his own load? I'm not quite sure where you're going with this, Paul. Well, I mean, I guess you could say on the one hand, on the horizontal plane, that is in our relationship to one another, to our neighbors. On the horizontal plane, perhaps someone may have a reason to boast. Maybe one carries more of a load than another. The Apostle Paul does something like this in his writing to the Philippians and in his writing to the Corinthians. I mean, he does boast. There is some truth to that, although it's very important to point out that he constantly says as he's boasting, how foolish am I for doing this? He's just doing it as an example. But no matter what, vertically speaking, friends, nothing we do can actually ever give us reason to boast. So what in the world does this mean? What is Paul talking about? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned because I'm going to get to that, and I'm going to tie it in with what we're going to read a little bit later in the passage. But let's keep on moving on as Paul continues to instruct about what the fellowship in freedom looks like. And he says in verse 6, essentially, be supportive to your leaders. That's going to help foster fellowship too. Be supportive to your leaders. Look at verse 6. Let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Share all good things can can be understood in many ways. It could be monetarily, certainly. It could be just sharing highlights of life. It could be talking about something that you've appreciated being under your pastor or elder's care. But the idea is that you wouldn't just hide that, but that you'd share that. I got to tell you, there's a whole lot of pastors out there that could really use the encouragement, my friends, because sometimes, those of us who've been in ministry, we wonder, and it's good to hear the encouragement. So if you've been blessed by a pastor, you've been blessed by a leader, don't be afraid to tell them. Don't worry, they're not going to get puffed up. No. They need the encouragement. Don't be afraid. So Paul ends up saying in verse 7, basically, let me sum up what I'm telling you. Especially if we connect this with back in chapter 5, where he talks about the battle between the flesh and the spirit. In summary, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. Now, is this saying that if someone is struggling with sin, that they're not saved and they're going to hell? I don't think so, but I do think it is a reality. That if one does so to the flesh as a Christian, they will face the consequences of their flesh, and indeed, it could lead to a point at which someone rejects the faith. Nevertheless, I do think that this is ultimately just pointing out a fact of life, that if you reap to fleshly things, it will have an impact on your life. It will be hard. Think of the life of King David, and you don't need any greater example than that. Yes, King David was a man after God's own heart, and yet David's life was filled with hardships because of the many decisions, the fleshly decisions that he made. So Paul goes on, instead of reaping corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Yes, in other words, Paul is saying again, do good things for the benefit of your neighbor. Do good things that will help out your fellow Christians in the household of faith. They need you to. The good things are not done to save you, but the good things are done for their benefit. And so through your various vocations, do those things. And so you might just say, hearing this, well, I guess it's just that simple. It sounds, Paul gives a number of exhortations here that we should do, and so we ought to just do them. We should be humble, and we should be forgiving, and we should carry each other's burdens, and we should be honest with ourselves about what we can and can't do. And yes, we should be always encouraging to our leaders, and we could go on and on with the list, and we can say, amen, yes, that's what we should do. And yet the reality is, any of us who have lived for any length of time know that the reason community is so hard is because each one of us are sinners that fail to do these things consistently or often or even regularly at all. The fact is, as much as we affirm all that Paul has exhorted the church to in this passage, we are also forced to recognize that we fall short in many ways. We can become conceited. Sure, we can look for the empty praise. We can withhold forgiveness because that person, after all, doesn't deserve it. We can fall into temptation. Of course we can. We do it every day. We can be critical instead of encouraging. We can sow to the flesh more than the Spirit. And the reality is, that leaves us asking the question, what in the world could we possibly boast in? If we go back to that verse and we say, what do you mean, Paul, that you can boast in yourself? Well, I don't think Paul wants us to boast in ourselves at all. As a matter of fact, I think what comes next in our passage is going to tell us very clearly that, in fact, the only thing we should boast in is the cross of our Lord. It turns out that if we do a healthy examination of ourselves, as that verse calls for in verse 4, that we're going to find things only to confess, that we're not going to find things to boast of. But Paul does not despair. Why? As he picks up the pen from his amanuensis at the end of the letter to the Galatians, he writes in verse 11 of chapter 6, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. For even those who are circumcised do not themselves keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised that they may boast in your flesh. Paul is again going back to a theme in his letter that we don't have to do any works again. And then he says these very important words. Remember what he said in verse 4 and verse 5, that only if you've done a real true examination of yourself can you boast about what you've done. Look at what Paul does instead, verse 14. But far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. Do you see how that changes everything? When we boast in the cross instead of anything in ourselves, then not only do we see ourselves as sinners that needed saving at the very expense of the Son of God himself dying on a cross, but we also see our neighbors that way, and that changes our entire perspective. No longer is our neighbor an enemy. They are someone for whom Christ died. That's the point. That's what Paul is saying. Forget all the boasting about anything except the cross. Lift high the cross. As he'll go on to say, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation that we are indeed granted by the grace of God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So yes, we are people that wish to live in freedom and that wish to live in fellowship, and yet we are people that recognize the very basis of that fellowship and the strength of that fellowship and the ability for that fellowship to continue on forever and ever is only because of what Jesus Christ has accomplished on our behalf, and that is indeed what we need to unite us. I hope that's encouraging to you. Have a great week. I'll look forward to seeing you next week. God's richest blessings to you.